This is us. I'm Scott. I work at BP Logix. This is Joby. He's the reason I get to work at BP Logix. And today we're going to talk a little bit about finding your way through the layers of data that make up your applications that you're building for your customers. So traditionally, right, you're sort of sucking in data, excuse me, from a variety of sources through these data that begin as data sources, right? So you might have connectors begin as data sources that some data custodian owns, a database, right? So somebody has a database, it's not your database, it's somebody else's, they're taking care of it. So it's the implementer. Now on the bottom there it says implementer, and I realize you're all going to just have to take my word for it. And the implementer has to write queries, against this data source. And then for each one of those queries, like sort of individually, there's a consumer, right? So I have a field on a form that's filled out, or a drop-down, or I have a decision I'm going to make about routing in a process. Each one of those is a consumer. Each one of them is going to have their own query associated with it, possibly going to the same data source, possibly going to different ones. Obviously, and I'm not going to talk too much about this because I have 10 more seconds, virtual data objects are partly to get around that many-to-many type, or that one-to-one type problem. So you have your data source just like you did before, but now you have this layer in between, right? This virtual data object that lives, kind of right there. And the virtual data object is there to abstract things between the custodian and the implementer. So the implementers don't have to be as smart. They don't have to know that much about the data source. And you can virtualize that away, right? You can abstract that away. It's the star in your variable name. Now the consumers, because now you have these virtual data objects that are encapsulated and standalone, the consumers can use, multiple consumers can use a single virtual data object. So that's one of the huge benefits. We're going to show you more of this. So if I look at this as process director business values, which are virtual data objects, of course we have the data sources. You're going to see in a minute what I mean by non-traditional. Not all data sources are databases, especially in our system. And then in the business value itself, which is the sort of the shaded square, in the business value itself is where you've put these queries or web servers, the information that the publisher has about how to get that information, and also which of that information and in what form the publisher wants to make available for implementers, okay? So the publisher may be an implementer, or the publisher may be somebody who's completely separate from implementation lifecycle and is just there to share data with the world. So that leads to an interesting layering effect that kind of arises naturally out of this, where I might have an external database and I have a business value. I might have some form data. The business value is relying on this external database, but that's all kind of inside something. And I might build a knowledge view based on that. In our system, that's one of these tabular reports, right? A search result or a report. I might build a knowledge view that accesses that. And the knowledge view only knows these two things. It doesn't need to know this. And it doesn't know that much about these other than what's published. But I might decide also that I want to build a chart on top of this knowledge view. Now, knowledge view until now is a presentation layer only thing, but we've now converted it into more of a model layer, right? Does that make sense? So I can kind of hide the presentation piece of that. This just acts like a table. The problem is when I'm doing this stuff, and I think something I haven't seen addressed yet so far, I was wondering if I would, is, okay, I have layer on layer of data here, right? Layer on layer of data. So the question is, when this chart doesn't look right, and I'm going to give you a more profound example in a few minutes, when that chart doesn't look right, where did I go wrong, right? Where did the train derail along that track? So what we've endeavored to do is to give you some tools to find, as an implementer, to find where that train derailed to help you discover it. So I think first we're going to start with, by the way, I have 75 seconds left over from that Bruce suggested that I auction off. So at the end of this, I'll be taking requests. It's a lot of 5 slides. I'm only selling it as an individual lot, so you'll. That's right. You have to be proactive, man. Okay, so we're going to start with the working one.
Yeah, we'll start with the working one. So, and as Scott was saying, I'm going to show a few different things, but the objects that can use these data sources are varied. It can be a lot of things. It can be a user, it can be a chart, it can be a process, it can be goals, it can be a lot of different things. We're going to just take a simple example to start with, one that makes it a little bit easier to kind of understand the different layers. So I have an example here where I've got a chart. This is just an example of a chart. So this is the chart he was just showing up there a minute ago. So this is something where I ran this chart, but in running this chart, what I'm seeing is just a chart that's going against data within our system. It may be data within another system, but it's transparent to me, the person that actually put together this chart. What I have the ability to do is now jump over and, from an implementer's perspective, be able to trace what's actually going on. So I can inspect the different layers and see what objects are using it. So there's actually two issues here. One is just what objects are using what objects. Since we can abstract these out and we have business values, we have all these different objects, knowing what objects are participating in that data feed, what's contributing to a decision being made to start an activity or to a chart. But then the next is to be able to inspect the values to see when something doesn't go right. So I'm going to start here by just saying I want to trace all users. Now, when I say trace all users, what that means is I could trace an individual user, I could trace processes. This is just showing an example here where I'm logged in as a user, just a couple of different users. This particular user might run a report. It just returns some data. I'm going to go back over to the user I was logged in here a minute ago as Scott. When I run that, it runs this report. When I go over and I take a look at the data that's being traced, when I look at this, what it's actually showing me is it traced information from two different users, one from Scott, one from this user Ron, and it's showing me that both of them executed, in this case, a chart, but usually this will be much more complex. We'll show that in a moment. It'll execute a chart, and in this case, both executed it just one time, and now what I can do is zoom down and see a little bit more about that. So I'm going to look at this, and I want to see.
So just to clarify,
Yeah.
so right, we go through it fast because we have a very short amount of time, but I don't want to lose the thread. And the thread is, you logged in as two different users. He ran two different charts, right? And now as an implementer, as an admin, because we want to compare them side by side, so we've given ourselves, godlike rights to be able to do that. Side by side, we're going to look at, how those executions ran and just show you that ability to see between those layers, right? And how that data is getting passed from one part to another. So you really get complete insight all the way back from the beginning, from where your data live, all the way to what happened in your process or in your chart or whatever.
And as Scott had mentioned, it can be used by an implementer, somebody who's just going through and developing a process or developing goals or something, and they're trying to see what's triggering it or why a decision's being made or why a chart's being driven. But it also can be used to diagnose why did a particular activity get triggered in a process, or somebody else that's running a report that's not seeing the right results. So it gives me the ability to go and inspect things beyond just what I'm working on. In this particular case, this particular chart is showing here, and this matches close to what his slides were. That chart that is actually being driven from a knowledge view, and a knowledge view, as Scott had mentioned, is a grid-like format where it's returning data, typically data from within our system, records that were collected as part of a process. But that knowledge view, this is showing here the relationship where that knowledge view is actually calling out in our environment a business rule, and that business rule is returning data, and that business rule happens to be calling a business value. So different object types doing different types of things. What I'm going to do is drill down into that business value because I want to get a little bit more information as far as what's happening. So when I do that, it's showing me that this business rule called customer full name is actually, in this case, called several different times or 6 different times. I can drill down into one of these. I'm going to click on the customer full name. It's showing me here the input and it's showing me the output. So at each stage when I'm inspecting every layer, I'm able to see what came in, what command was actually executed, and then what the output of that is. So I can work my way down through that inspection process and be able to see where did things not go right. So when I'm looking at this one, I can see what the input was, this customer ID. I can see this name that's here. I can go down further because I may want to go down to the business value. When I go to the business value, in this case, the business value happens to be executing a database command. So now this particular business value, I can see the SQL that's generated, the input, and then the output. And you'll notice that the output is a little bit different than the output that is produced by the business rule above it.
Yeah, so to be clear, right, what you're seeing here is multiple, and we limited it to 6. It's adjustable, but you want to be able to see what you're doing, right? So that chart had a lot of data on it, had a lot of data points. There's a couple hundred transactions, I think, in there. For each one we produced who is involved in that transaction. So right when you're generating a chart, you're going through the series, generating all the data points. And so as this rule, right? What is this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote it, and I don't remember. As this rule, I wrote it like literally 2 days ago, and I don't remember. As this rule is being called repeatedly in order to produce, the data for the series, each time it's calling, or the rules are called once. Each time it's, running through another data point in the series. So you start to see these. There's a lot more than 6 data points. We limit it, here for visibility.
So this is an example of something that, again, showing me the objects that are involved in some type of decision or some type of a chart, but it's also showing me the data as I can inspect that. I'm going to go into one that's a little bit more complex. So what I'm going to do is just kind of step back, come back over here. From here, what we'll do is we're going to go into one that actually is going to produce not the right results. So, we're using a chart just because it's a little bit more visual, but again, something not returning the correct results is generally going to do things in our system a little bit more than drive the wrong chart. It's actually going to drive process wrong. That things aren't going to occur when they need to occur. They're going to occur when they shouldn't. So there's a very tight relationship between the process timeline activities and the different conditions and these data elements. But in this case, the chart's nice and easy to show. It's showing here that I'm just showing total returns by city. So these are processes that run data that was collected for returns. When I look at this, I can look at this and it doesn't look right. Baltimore doesn't seem like it's the right city. There's probably more than just one that's had returns. What I'm going to do now is expand down here, take a look at the things that were run. I'm running right now as Scott, as this particular user. I can see that this chart was run, this one called returns by city, and now what I'm going to do is drill down into it so that I can actually see a little bit more about the execution. So when I'm looking at this, what I'm actually seeing now is that particular chart is calling a knowledge view again, so it's pretty common, but a chart can call a business value directly or call other things. But this one's calling a knowledge view. This knowledge view is actually calling two different other data objects. It's actually calling a business value. It's actually calling two business values. One of the business values that it's calling is a REST call. It's actually returning back a state based on a zip code. So what I'm going to do is drill down into this. When I take a look at this, it's showing me here that there's a business value that is called REST zip code. Here's a few of the different outputs. When I click on this, what it's actually showing me now at this lowest level, it's showing me the actual command that was executed. In this case, it's a URL. It was a REST URL. It's showing me the input to that, and it's actually showing me the output to that. So that was the output that came back from the call. I can click on each one of these and inspect each one, and as I go through this, I can look and I can notice that each one of the zip codes happens to be the same. It's this 21201. So that kind of tells me that's probably not what this was intended to do, because it should be sending in different zip codes. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to go back and I'm going to take a look at that particular data feed. So when I look at that particular data feed, that chart that we were looking at a moment ago, that chart is actually being fed from a data source. In this case, the data source is coming from a knowledge view, this one called all returns. When I look at that knowledge view and I zoom down into it, so let me get it up so you can see the top of the screen.
Top of the screen kind of thing. There you
so when I look at this is showing me the columns that are returned in this particular knowledge view. Knowledge view, think of it as a very simple way to create something comparable to like a SQL view, but something that I don't need to know anything about SQL. I'm just simply returning the type of data, or identifying the data that I want to be able to see, and the filter that will return the right results. When you look at this, I can see I've got a column here for city, and I've actually got this zip code hard-coded here. So this is an example where I might have been testing, put something together. This isn't right. I want to change that. I want that zip code to be the zip code for that particular record. So I'm going to change that configuration. When I change the configuration, I can see that I actually was just testing, and I just plugged in a standard zip code. And now what I'm going to do is map that to something else. And what's important here is I'm showing that there's a business value here that's called REST zip code. There's a property called city that's being used, and there's an input called zip. And I'm actually going to pass as input information that was collected on the submission, on the request for, or on the form that actually had the return request.
So this is an example of a virtual data object, right? And how we configure it, because we're saying, or how we use it, right? So this is an example of how an implementer uses a virtual data object. All he did was, or she, was select, which object the implementer wanted from a list, and it could be a bunch of things, but in this case it's business values, and we happen to have that. That list gives me all the various properties I could select from that particular virtual data object. Once I do that, the data object also has input parameters associated with it, so I specify that. There's not a lot of guessing about what parameters it needs or how they need to be or anything like that. So this is what the publisher's done for us, right? The publisher's created my ability to just pull these down, fill them in as part of my implementation, all in service of making the implementation easier and pushing down the level of skill I need for an implementer to actually be able to build these things, right? Right? Okay, go.
So I'm going to go ahead and save this. This is now showing that it's passing the variable, the zip code that was pulled from the form, into that business value. So when I run this now, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go back over and I'm going to run this chart again. When I run this chart, we'll see if it looks a little bit different. And now it starts looking a little bit different. I start seeing different cities with the total returns. But again, just a normal chart, but where that data is coming from is a lot of different places. When I jump back over here, I'm going to take a look at these data flows again. When I look, I can see that there's another execution of this chart called returns by city. I'm going to go ahead and zoom into that. When I zoom into that now, I can start inspecting the data again, drill down into that data. And when I drill down, I'm going to start seeing things that make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to see a zip code that's different for each one of these, and the actual return data that's coming back from that. So this is an example of where the information was wrong, but I was able to kind of zoom down, inspect the different layers, and figure out what went wrong with that. While I'm looking at this, happens to be another column on there on that knowledge view that's being fed, not from form data, but fed from another external data source. When I drill down on that, this one's showing me that there's a returns database that it's going to. So when I click on that, this returns database is showing me that the actual, again, similar to before, the command that's being executed, the input that was coming in, and the actual output. So this is giving me access to another column that's being used to fill, or another data element that's being used to fill a column inside of that knowledge view.
So, we've been showing this sort of as respects a chart because it's very easy to see the results on the chart, right? It's like, you're able to see, how you might notice an error, what happens when you dig down, make a change, and how the chart looks different. That's a nice thing to have. I mean, don't get me wrong. It turns out when you build a chart and it's got 1 million data points in it and it's not quite right, it turns out it was tricky without this to be able to figure out where you went wrong. So that's non-trivial. That's a non-trivial requirement. But how many of you memorized last year's presentation? All right, there you go. Fine, good, thank you. All right, so I'm going to start that now. So all I'm going to do is remind you of a couple of salient points about that. And one of them was, you remember that in process timeline, which was the thing we kind of showed you last year, in process timeline, every activity wants to run all the time, but there are these constraints, right, that either keep an activity from running or cause it to begin running, right? There's no token being passed around, or this isn't bpmN, this is a completely separate thing. So those constraints are all built out of conditions that are very much like the conditions we were just showing you that go into the building of a knowledge view or a chart or a business rule or anything else. It's actually literally the same condition builder. So here in this request referral step, we have what I called last year, remember, an eligibility condition, right? An eligibility condition is like once precedence has been satisfied, once my predecessors have all completed, am I still eligible to run? Like when do I become eligible to run? So this has an eligibility requirement here. The eligibility requirement is...
Sorry, I was going too far.
The eligibility requirement is specified here. If you can scroll it up, great. If not, and we'll break that down a little bit for you as well, just using the condition builder. And you see, so when the implementer specified, okay, when is this activity eligible to run? Builder said, well, when this particular. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll let you.
Actually, you could tell them what this is, because I don't actually even know.
So in this particular example, this is showing that there's actually a business rule that's going against a case property. So this was part of last year's presentation, but the important part about this is that the way that I'm actually defining the different conditions, the different behaviors of things, is consistent within the system. And I'm using these data objects, so I'm using them in a way that I don't actually have to, I don't have to know anything about it. So in this case, I'm going to say, I want to use a business value called my customer zip. This is the one we were using a minute ago, and now I have to pass a customer ID. That customer ID might be coming from a case property, might be coming from a form field, it might be coming from
random number generator.
Lots of different places. But the important part is it's going to walk me through that configuration. Once I've got that business rule in this particular case, the business value is going to return some value, and then I can test that value against something else. And that something else, again, might be static value, might be case property, might be something else. But This is how I'm defining the different behaviors. And in this case, all of that constitutes what. So in this, if I had something like this, all of this constitutes when this particular activity is going to be triggered. Now it's going back over towards process timeline.
So that's now an eligibility requirement for this activity. So I don't know if other BPM vendors here have this experience. you have a customer who calls and says, you know, this process has been running fine, but in this one instance, you know, this activity didn't run and it was supposed to, right? Like nobody ever got assigned this task, or this thing didn't happen. And you know, and the question you ask yourself is, well, okay, but I wasn't there, you know, and that time is gone, here come and gone, and you can't reproduce it. So what is it? Well, it turns out, you know, if you're an implementer, it's really nice to be able to trace your way through these things and find out exactly why this particular instance took the path it did, not just based on, right? Everybody here so far has shown you the logic. In other words, you see all the like little conditional steps and then which way it went based on the conditions, but you don't see why, right? You don't see why that condition was satisfied, why I took a left turn here or a right turn, and if I do know why, then what data was that decision based on, and if so, what data was that decision was that based on, that calculation? So what we're doing is giving you a way to get insight into your process, how it ran or how it's running, into every part of it, right? The display parts like charts, the execution, the operational parts, into every part of it, all the way down to the roots of, you know, what's really making it go. So that gives you kind of ultimately the most transparency, the most process transparency I think you can possibly, you know, you can possibly offer, although I'm sure we'll think of something else that's even more. But is that,
yeah,
I think that
yeah,
pretty much
actually,
cover it?
yeah, and then
We have a few
just going
minutes
back,
for
just to kind of tie into that particular, because everybody's going to have the ability, you know, us included, to be able to tell you kind of what's happened historically. So it might be something that's running, it might be something that had happened a year ago, and so you can look at it, you can see what's happened, who did what, you know, kind of very common types of things you'd expect. So this happens to be a running process. But on here, if there was a condition as to when this particular thing is needed. So for example, there's a condition on here that says department head approval is only needed under certain conditions. If I'm looking at something in the past, it'll be able to tell you that that condition was met. But now it has the ability to go down and tell you why, because that data, that condition might be coming, that answer, that reason that this step is needed might be coming from another system. That might actually be coming from some other service where a call was made out to another application to say, is this condition met? Is this activity actually needed? So now it'll let you dissect that back down. So instead of just simply seeing that, yeah, this step was needed, the condition or the rule said, yeah, it needed to run or it needed to start. Now I can inspect those layers, especially when it starts going back to data outside of our system.